Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of Canada Talks Electric Cars webinar, brought to you by the Electric Vehicle Society. This webinar is held on the first Tuesday of each month, and it is our aim to examine a broad range of EV-related topics from a Canadian perspective. I'm delighted to be a guest moderator for this webinar. My name is Nino Di Cara. I'm an EV Society member and publisher of the news publication Electric Autonomy Canada. Electric Vehicle Society is a national Canadian organisation whose goal is to leverage the expertise of EV owners and enthusiasts to help other Canadians transition to electric transportation through education and advocacy. Associate membership is free, but you would help us greatly if you'd consider a full membership. It's only $30 a year, and seniors, it's only $20, so it's well worth signing up. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you're interested in learning more about EVs and interacting with fellow enthusiasts, we invite you to join us at one of our free chapter meetings, now held every month virtually by video conference. Today's webinar is being recorded for later viewing on the EV Society YouTube channel, and you can find the EV Society YouTube channel just by searching for that name on YouTube, and on there you'll find a selection of our past webinars, and be sure to subscribe to make sure you don't miss future ones. Today's webinar will run for no longer than 60 minutes. All guests have joined with your microphones muted, so don't worry, we won't hear you if we're not meant to. But we do invite you to take part, and you can do this by asking our guest speakers questions at any time using the webinar's Q&A function. And if you're watching this now on Zoom, if you look to the bottom right of your Zoom window, you'll see there's a Q&A button just there. The chat function will not be enabled, and your questions will not be seen there. So it's important that you post them in the Q&A section. One of our team members will read out your questions immediately following the presentation. So in addition to posting Q&A questions, you can actually upvote questions that others have asked that you would like to hear answered. If you can do this by just actually clicking the thumbs up icon next to the question in the same way you would like something in social media. And this moves your question that question higher up on the list and will help us prioritize those questions to be asked. So now I'd like to welcome our two speakers for the evening, Dr. Joyce Lee and Dr. Jeremy Theal, who will be presenting today's webinar, which is titled The Impact of EVs on Climate Change and Your Health in Canada. To give a broader introduction, Dr. Joyce Lee is Care of the Elderly Physician at North York General Hospital, and Dr. Jeremy Theal is a staff gastroenterologist and the Chief Medical Information Officer at North York General Hospital. In 2018, they trained under Nobel Laureate Al Gore to become climate reality leaders. And since that time, they've gone on to give more than 40 presentations about climate change to various groups across Canada. Their goal is to share the scientific certainty, the immediacy, and the impacts of the climate crisis while inspiring people to act on this hugely important issue. Among other things on this webinar, they'll be explaining why driving an electric vehicle is an important step to combat climate change. Drs. Lee and Theal, welcome to EV Society and the Canada Talks September webcast. It's now my great pleasure to pass the microphone and screen over to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So today we're going to talk about climate change, your health, and the impact of electric vehicles. We're going to learn about the immediacy, the impacts and importance of the climate crisis, including impacts to your health and well-being, and learn how the adoption of EVs can help reduce carbon emissions and thereby mitigate part of climate change and the impact on our health. Now, it's no secret that we're in a global pandemic, and you can see that since the COVID-19 pandemic has started, almost 850,000 people have died globally. On May 26, 2020, Al Gore did a webinar town hall, and he said how reckless it can be to ignore scientific warnings, which is a very poignant quote about the pandemic, but also about climate crisis. About pandemics, the scientists have long predicted that this is actually a predictable occurrence in light of globalization, travel, and viral mutations. 70% of emerging human diseases originate from animals, either domesticated or wild. And as we decrease the buffer zones through deforestation, industrial agriculture, and so on and so forth, and have closer contact with animals, then there's a higher chance of these viruses coming over to the human side and causing pandemics. On the other hand, the climate crisis is also a very predictable occurrence, and the scientists have known about it for decades in light of our ongoing use of fossil fuels to power our economy. It leads to multiple interconnected, deleterious environmental, economic, and health effects. In fact, the climate crisis is a much bigger public health crisis compared to COVID-19. From the example of COVID-19, we can see that leadership style makes a huge difference. Now let's take a look at the reactive and politicized, such as the US and Brazil. We can see from this chart that the US and Brazil topped the world globally in terms of the number of total cases of COVID-19 as well as the number of deaths. Now compare this to a proactive and science-based approach, such as in New Zealand and Taiwan, and look at their number of total cases and the number of deaths. Huge difference. And this is perhaps a predictor of how differences in responses to climate change will also result in different outcomes. So in light of the number of deaths in the US, perhaps there needs to be a new life-saving face mask in the US, and it may have to take the form of this. Unfortunately, the same global leaders that are denying science in the case of COVID-19 has also been denying that climate change is real. It has been known for decades, not only by scientists, but also politicians and oil companies, that the climate crisis is real. In fact, Exxon was pulled into court last year to testify about how they had misled their investors. Listen to this.
Dr. Hoffert, your work with Exxon was focused on the carbon cycle and climate modeling. I have a slide up here. Are you familiar with this graph from 1982? Can you briefly explain what it shows?
Sure. What it shows is a projection into the future of carbon dioxide levels and climate change associated with those carbon dioxide levels. And it's a very accurate representation of what today's climate change actually is.
So this was a model from 1982 with startlingly accurate projections into the present
That's
day.
correct.
The orange line shows the actual level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through this year. And the blue line shows the actual average temperature change. So in 1982, Exxon accurately, 1982, 7 years before I was even born, Exxon accurately predicted that by this year, 2019, the Earth would hit a carbon dioxide concentration of 415 parts per million and a temperature increase of 1 degree Celsius. Dr. Hoffert, is that correct?
We were excellent scientists.
Yes, you were. Yes, you were. So they knew.
So they knew. And AOC was absolutely correct in saying that there was a 1 degree increase in global surface temperature, as you can see on this graph, since the 1950s. In fact, 19 of the 20 hottest years on record have occurred since the year 2001, and the hottest of all have been the last 5 years. This is perhaps not surprising when we think about the amount of energy trapped by the man-made global warming pollution is the equivalent to exploding 500,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs every day, 365 days of the year. And we know that the largest source of global warming pollution is the burning of fossil fuels. You might have heard people say that, oh, this is all just a cycle. The Earth goes through cycles of CO2 concentration and temperatures. Right now, we can actually put that myth to rest. The scientists can now drill down to the Antarctic ice cores and determine the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere over the past 800,000 years. You can see that it does go through a cycle. And the temperature is a close correlate of the CO2 concentration. But the CO2 concentration has never been above the green line, which is 300 parts per million. Now, take a look at what has happened since the Industrial Revolution. We are now at 415 parts per million, which has never happened on the planet for the past 800,000 years. If we continue business as usual, we're going to reach 600 parts per million after 40 more years. That would make the planet uninhabitable. Now let's take a look at the global direct effects of climate change for a minute. That would include temperature extremes, the water cycle, drought, wildfires, and storms. Now let's take a look at temperature extremes. In Canada, our temperatures have actually increased by an estimated 1.7 degrees since 1948 versus the global average of 0.8. In other words, we're warming at 2 times the global average, and in northern Canada, we're warming at 3 times the global average. As a result of this, the number of hot days in Canada will triple or quadruple by the mid to end of the century. Similarly, the temperatures in Europe has been increasing. 2019 was Europe's hottest year on record in multiple countries, and many countries, including France, Germany, Netherlands, UK, Belgium, and Luxembourg, all broke their all-time high temperature records. In Paris last year in June, they reached 46 degrees Celsius. And similarly, this year in Australia, at the beginning of the year, it reached very high temperatures in parts of Australia. In Canberra on January 5th, it reached 44 degrees. Heat waves worldwide have resulted in more than 79 million deaths in the last 25 years. That's data from only 20 countries and not including any in Africa. And this, of course, has also happened in Canada as well. We all remember what happened in the heat wave a couple of years ago in Montreal and in Toronto. If we continue business as usual, we're going to see 3 times to 20 times the increase in heat wave related deaths in the next 50 years. And the most vulnerable people, such as the elderly, the disabled, and children, and pregnant women would be the ones that are most affected. Now let's take a look at the water cycle. 93% of that extra heat that's trapped by greenhouse gases goes into the ocean, causing warming of the ocean and acidification. And the ocean temperature, similar to our global surface temperature, has set a new record in 2019, and 2020 is likely to set another new record. We can take a look at the Arctic sea ice. So of course, with the warming temperatures, we're seeing the sea ice extent decreasing. Compare 1984 to 2012. Last year, the first monument to the first glacier loss to climate change was erected in Iceland. As the sea ice melts, that causes increase in sea level. And 1/3 of the world's population live within 100 kilometers of a coastline. If we take a look at the top 10 cities at risk from sea level rise in 2070 by the amount of assets, we can recognize some very well-known cities like New York, Miami, Tokyo, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. Right now, already almost $130 billion worth of New York City real estate is lying in a flood zone. As the temperatures increase, the oceans also evaporate more moisture into the sky in addition to the sea ice melting. With each additional 1 degree of temperature rise, the atmosphere's capacity to hold water vapor increases by 7%. Now that might seem like a random statistic until you see this time-lapse photography clip. This is called a supercell storm, or an urban rain bomb. Now you can see the absolutely biblical catastrophic proportions of rain being dumped on Tucson, Arizona, because of the warmer temperatures holding more moisture in the air. Now, this sort of rainfall, of course, has also affected Canada. In Toronto in 2013, 12.6 centimeters of rain fell in under 2 hours. That resulted in a lot of property losses, a lot of people being stranded. And the same thing happened in 2018. You see the streetcar that is stranded there, resulting in $80 million in insured damages and leaving 16,000 people without power. In 2019, in Muskoka, in Ontario, so cottage country, a state of emergency was declared due to rising water and widespread flooding. This is also because of this abnormal rainfall pattern. The rainfall anomalies in Canada has been increasing over the years. As you can see, the amount of rainfall has been way more than average in Canada over the past few decades. So now let's take a look at drought and wildfires. That same extra heat that evaporates more water from the ocean, causing bigger downpours and floods, is also pulling water from the land. So that results in longer and deeper droughts. In Canada, many parts of our country has been subjected to this kind of drought condition, especially the food basket area. Because of this, there has been changes and decreases in agricultural yields, and the food prices have been rising because of the insecurity of the yields, especially in fruits and vegetables. If we continue business as usual in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we'll see much of North America desertified by the end of the century and unable to support any agriculture. This Syrian farmer said in 2010 that he had 400 acres of wheat, which was all turned to desert. This happened because between 2006 to 2010, a very severe drought turned 60% of Syria's fertile land into desert, and it drove 1 million people into Syria's already crowded cities. We all know the result of that. When this kind of instability in food and job security and so forth, livelihood, drives people into crowded cities, an unstable situation becomes even more unstable. And that resulted in a lot of conflict and the Syrian refugee crisis, which was actually only 4 million people. If we continue this pattern of global warming, by 2050, uninhabitable equatorial conditions can result in between 143 million to 1.5 billion climate refugees. Now, can you think of what kind of instability that would cause globally, politically, and in all the other arenas? Now, hotter years typically also have more fires. You can see a very close correlation on this graph here. This is the terrible forest fire in Fort McMurray in Alberta in 2016, where a lot of people lost their homes and there were a lot of deaths. And people actually a lot of people have post-traumatic stress disorder from this, to the degree that people had more suicidality and mental health issues after the forest fire. In British Columbia in 2018, a total of 2,000 wildfires happened, burning 1 million hectares of beautiful BC forest. And it resulted in the worst air quality in the world, even compared to countries like India. Now, for the entire summer, people with respiratory conditions or other illnesses like cardiac illnesses and so forth, they couldn't even leave their home. We know that from the data from medicine that when wildfires happen, there's a 20 to 30% increase in the number of heart attacks and strokes that land people in emerge, especially for older folks. Now let's talk about storms. How does the climate crisis impact hurricanes? Now, first, warmer oceans will lead to more intense hurricanes. Hurricanes will intensify much more rapidly. And now these intense hurricanes are going beyond the category 5. The scientists are talking about adding a category to describe them. Because warmer air holds more moisture, it also leads to the heavier downpours, as we have seen before. So more flooding. Storm surge increases due to sea level rise. And finally, a wavier jet stream will hold the storm in place longer, meaning that an intense hurricane can sit over a city, dumping tons of water on that city for a longer period of time. Now, we all remember what happened in New York in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy struck New York and caused massive flooding and massive damage to infrastructure. The risk of Hurricane Sandy intensity events in New York used to be much lower. Let's take a look. In 1880, it used to be a 1 in 500 year occurrence. In 2017, 1 in 25 years. But by 2030 to 2045, if we continue this trend of global warming, we're going to see it 1 in every 5 years. Now, I cannot possibly imagine how a city like New York or one like Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, how can we possibly rebuild every 5 years if something like this happens? And once again, recently, there's another hurricane, Hurricane Laura, in August 2020, which intensified from tropical storm to Category 4 in less than 36 hours, leaving many people stranded and without their homes. Now, this is a double whammy because of COVID-19. Normally, you would house all these people in a big building, but now, because of the risk of COVID-19, where are you going to put all these people? We can see from this graph that the worldwide extreme weather events have really increased over the past 40 years. It has increased 4 times. And this results in a lot of economic losses. From extreme weather, it totaled $653 billion over the past 2 years alone, globally. So you can see that climate crisis is not only a medical emergency as stated by the Lancet Commission on Health and Climate Change here, but also really an economic emergency. And the media is picking this up. This is Reader's Digest from last year. It's talking about how the climate crisis is making Canadians sick in many different ways. Now let's take a look. How does climate change affect health? Climate change affects health through a very complex interrelated web. And we're gonna touch on a few of this today. We already talked about extreme heat, extreme weather events, and some of these will result in food insecurity as we touched upon. Now we're going to move on to some of the other ones like air pollution. Globally, air pollution from fossil fuels already kills 8.7 million people worldwide, and that's compared to smoking, which kills 7.2 million people per year. Much of this effect occurs through particulate matter, or PM 2.5. It turns out that when we're exposed to PM 2.5, when we breathe in air pollution, it can increase our risk of heart disease and stroke. And 50 to 80% of air pollution related deaths are actually secondary to heart disease and stroke as opposed to lung illnesses. In Canada, we're not immune to this. 14,000 Canadians died prematurely in 2017 because of exposure to PM 2.5. And this is in comparison to fewer than 3,000 people dying from car accidents annually. Now, Jeremy's going to talk to you about a study, a very interesting study on clearing the air with EVs.
Thanks, Joyce. So actually, just a couple of months ago, a very interesting study was published called Clearing the Air. And this was a study looking specifically at the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area and what the effects would be if we were to broadly adopt electric vehicles and replace fossil fuel powered transportation. So in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area, they estimated that about 3,000 premature deaths occur every year due to air pollution from fossil fuels, and that one of the biggest sources of this air pollution is vehicle traffic, and that it's linked to all of the adverse and deleterious health effects that Joyce just mentioned. Now, what they did was they then looked at, okay, what can we do about this problem? They were able to calculate that replacing even just a single gas-powered vehicle with an electric vehicle results in about almost $10,000 of social benefits related to improved health, reduced healthcare costs, reduced absenteeism, and so forth. And that also, if we were able to switch all of our vehicles to electric, and also switch all the buses to electric, that we would already achieve half of the reductions needed to meet Ontario's 2030 carbon emission reduction targets. This chart here shows a good summary of the findings of the study, where you can see that if we were able to replace 100% of our cars and SUVs with electric, then per year we would save 7.6 megatons of greenhouse gases. We would have a social benefit of $2.4 billion socially, and we would save 313 lives. And then if we start adding in things like cleaner trucks and public transit buses, we get additional hundreds of lives saved per year, as well as billions of dollars in social benefit and reductions in greenhouse gases. So there's obviously a clear benefit to this. And tying back to the COVID-19 crisis, pardon me, must be the air pollution. The Harvard School of Public Health actually just recently published data looking at 98% of the US population. They looked back for 17 years of data, and what they showed is that over the long term, in areas of the country where people lived, where they were exposed to higher levels of PM2.5 from fossil fuels, they had an increase in dying, the increase in the risk of dying from coronavirus. So even just a single microgram of PM2.5 per meter cubed over many years was associated with an 8% increase in dying from COVID-19, which is very significant.
So now let's move on to infectious diseases. In med school, we learned that there are a lot of vectors for emerging infectious diseases, such as mosquitoes, ticks, and so forth. It turns out that these vectors really like warmer weather. So what we thought were tropical diseases have been on the move to higher latitude and altitude. We see this in Canada as well, that when we were learning about Lyme disease in med school, it wasn't really a real risk in Canada. But now, obviously, in Ontario, it is a very real risk. Because of the warmer temperatures, the upper geographical limit for the ticks have been moving north. And now, every year in the summer, we have to worry about ticks and Lyme disease. And this is going to keep going north as the temperature warms. Over the past 10 years, the incidence of Lyme disease has increased by 12. Now let's move on to mental health. I touched upon this a little bit earlier, but you can imagine that if one has to live through a natural disaster and other sort of extreme weather event and lose their home, a lot of people would end up with post-traumatic stress disorder. There's also an increase in suicide deaths and violent crime and assaults with increasing temperatures. When we see the devastation that happens to our planet, to animal populations, such as looking at that terrible picture of the little baby kangaroo stuck in the wildfire in Australia, I'm sure a lot of us are experiencing guilt, despair, and grief, thinking about what's happening to our planet and what we can do about it.
So we have to ask ourselves, is it really worth driving our economy on carbon when there are all these downstream effects on our lifestyle, our economy, and our health? It's already been named the #1 threat to the global economy. Well, how bad is it? Well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change commissioned a report that was published in October 2018, and the purpose of this report was to determine, should we be targeting a global temperature rise of no more than 2 degrees Celsius, or should we really be aiming lower at 1.5 degrees Celsius, keeping in mind that we're already at 1 degree Celsius now? And this study was based on 6,000 scientific references from 40 different countries. Unfortunately, what the report says is that everything past 1.5 degrees Celsius is actually a risk for irreversible change. In other words, climate change may actually get to the point that even if we all stopped emitting carbon the next day, we would be unable to stop a spiral of continuing increase in global temperature. And so the report was basically begging us to make rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. That we need to reduce our emissions by 45% below 2010 levels by 2030, and we need to have a net zero economy by 2050. So essentially, we have 10 years left to really turn the corner on this. Now, when I say 10 years left, I don't mean that the world's going to end in 10 years, but that we may get to the point where the positive feedback loops that we have started in motion will be irreversible even if we stop emitting carbon. This is because of, for example, increasing global temperatures melt Arctic permafrost, and under Arctic permafrost, there are millennia of decayed animal and plant matter, which is in the form of methane, which is a very strong greenhouse gas. When that gets released, it exacerbates the problem. When we lose the polar ice caps, which are white, then we're unable to reflect the energy of the sun back into space, and now it's absorbed by dark colored ocean water. Increasing wildfires lead to deforestation and therefore less carbon sink. Desertification of land, again, more deforestation and heat gain. And higher temps actually lead to more water vapor, and water vapor in the air is actually also a weak greenhouse gas, exacerbating the problem. And then finally, with warmer oceans, the oceans are actually a big carbon sink, as was mentioned earlier, and they're less able to take up more CO2 when they're warmer. So we really need to think very soberly that we are not the first civilization of humanity on this planet, and many civilizations before us who felt that they were very technologically advanced and in a very good place eventually exceeded their environmental capacity, got into war over resources, and died out. And we are heading that way if we don't change quickly. So what is our action plan? Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about reducing our carbon footprint, and specifically about EVs this evening, and then also a little bit about growing your political footprint, because I think that's a very important piece to the puzzle. Now, I asked Siri what a carbon footprint was, and most of the time Siri doesn't understand me, but in this case, she actually gave me a pretty good answer. She said it's the amount of carbon dioxide and other carbon compounds emitted due to the consumption of fuels by a particular person or group. Now, here's an example of some simple carbon footprint math. If you walk to work, you pretty much generate no CO2. If you were to fly from New York City to Los Angeles, that generates about 1 ton of CO2. Now, the average Canadian generates about 15 tons of CO2 per year. But what does that actually mean conceptually? Well, if you imagine at sort of ground level atmospheric pressure and temperature, 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide is about the size of a medium-sized 2-story house, or about enough to fill 5 hot air balloons. Now, Canada, you know, sometimes you'll hear right-wing politicians say, oh, we're a very small part of the problem, we don't need to worry about it. Well, it's true because we have a small population that our total CO2 emissions are smaller than other countries. However, if you look at our per capita emissions, we're actually tied for 2nd place as the worst emitters in the world. So Canadians are actually a big part of the problem per capita, and we all need to do something more about it. If we look at a picture of our carbon footprint, 15 metric tons of CO2 per year for the average Canadian, and compare it to a place like India, where the average person emits just about 1.7 tons of CO2, you can see the inequity and what's happening here. So I think this is, it shows it's all incumbent upon us to do more. So if we prioritize our actions, how can we reduce our carbon footprint? This from the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, or the former one, I should say, before she was fired by the current government and not replaced. It shows that 20 to 24% of our carbon footprint in the province of Ontario is related to driving. So obviously, this is a big part of the equation. And so let's focus on what we can do in terms of EVs. Now, Ontarians are driving more than ever. So actually, our passenger kilometers are increasing faster than our population, meaning that every driving more. And this is going to blow your mind. So actually, Canada has the least fuel-efficient vehicle fleet in the world. This is actually even worse than many developing countries. And it's because of this. Here are the top 5 best-selling vehicles that were in Q1 of this year. Pickup truck, pickup truck, pickup truck, pickup truck, SUV. And this is what we prefer to buy and drive in Canada. So it's not surprising we have the most gas-guzzling fleet in the world. Now, Joyce and I, we were enraptured by Tesla's mission to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. And this was a tweet that Elon Musk put out a couple of years ago, one of his more sane tweets, saying that Tesla exists to help reduce the risk of catastrophic climate change. And we thought that was good. We decided to buy an electric car. As soon as we bought the electric car, we went around and told everybody, hey, we bought this electric car. It's really great. It's super for the world. We're going to tell everyone at parties. But then I started to read some stuff online and I thought maybe we made a bad decision, because there's people saying that, for example, a Tesla Model S emits more lifetime CO2 than a petrol Super Mini. Okay, maybe we can ignore that article because it was on MSN. But here's another one from Wired. This says Tesla's electric cars are not as green as you might think. And another online source saying that the emissions from producing a Tesla battery is equivalent to driving an internal combustion engine car for 8.2 years. This is not sounding so good. Maybe we need to return this car. But then I started doing a little bit of math, and I wanted to just share this with you. So it is true that electric vehicles start off at a disadvantage in terms of total carbon emissions when they're first manufactured. The blue bar here shows you the amount of carbon that is created from just generating any type of, or manufacturing any type of new car. But at the top here, you can see that depending on the size of the battery of the electric vehicle that you buy, there is a component related to carbon emissions from producing the battery. But where we start to catch up as EV drivers is when we start to operate that vehicle. So you can see here that after 1 year, the electric vehicles only consume a tiny, or produce a tiny little bit of CO2 as they charge their batteries, whereas the gas car is producing a lot more CO2. And in fact, after just 1.27 years, driving a Nissan Leaf with a 30 kilowatt hour battery is already equivalent to driving that gas car. And after that, the gas car is surpassing it in terms of emissions. And if we move on to 3.1 years, a Tesla Model 3 is now already equal to the gas car, and everything beyond that is extra in the gas car. And then a Tesla Model S, 4.25 years. So this is somewhat reassuring, certainly better than the eight or so years we mentioned before. But then I was still seeing these references online saying, oh, no, if you had a vehicle like with a 100 kilowatt hour battery like a Tesla Model S, you would have to drive it for 17.8 years to balance out the emissions from an equivalent gas vehicle. But then I started to realize, wait a minute, this is in West Virginia. So this is an important piece of the equation, is where you charge your car. So if we look at a tale of two grids, here's Ontario's grid. This is the generation capacity. And then in terms of how much we actually use, so generally we don't turn on our fossil fuel powered peaker plants unless we have high demand. You can see here that 96% of our usage is actually fossil fuel free in Ontario. So when you're charging your electric vehicle, there's actually very few carbon emissions. Compare that to one of the worst examples in the US, East Kansas, where almost all of their electricity is produced by coal. And you can see that it's a very different picture, and charging a car in that area that's electric is obviously going to take a lot longer to balance out the carbon emissions. But there's another piece to this equation as well, which is that the grid changes over time. So electric vehicles are the only vehicle that you can buy that can actually get even more efficient over time because of the grid that you're charging from. So if we look at, for example, upstate New York here, 115 miles per gallon equivalent, if you were to charge a car, electric car in that area, or 78 in California. That was back in 2009. But now let's fast forward time, and you can see that these grids continue to improve because of the amount of renewables. So now in 2018, if you were to charge that same electric car, you're now getting the equivalent of 259 miles per gallon in upstate New York, because the grid you're charging from is so much less fossil fuel impact than it used to be, even though it's the same car you're driving. So this is an 85 to 225% efficiency gain in just 9 years, even though you're driving the same car. And 75% of people now live in areas where driving an electric car is cleaner than driving a 50 mile per gallon hybrid. And actually in most areas where there's active EV markets, the equivalent is about 85 miles per gallon, which of course doesn't even exist in a fossil fuel powered car. So in just pulling that all together then, the lifetime emissions, if you were to buy and drive a car for 10 years in Ontario, is 60 to 68% lower with an electric car versus an ICE vehicle, including the amount of work and energy and emissions that it takes to produce that particular car and or its battery. And there's other benefits to EVs as well. So the cost of fuel. If we look at a typical BMW 3 Series and its costs versus a Tesla Model 3, which is kind of a similar size car, you can see that the savings in fuel is about $6,800 over 5 years. And then the maintenance is way cheaper too, because an EV has only about 17 moving parts as compared to a gas drivetrain is about 200 moving parts. So this means it requires less maintenance, and also it breaks down less often. So the savings there calculated at about 57%. And if we look at a large study of a New York City municipal fleet, which has over 1,800 vehicles that are anywhere from a regular gas car to a hybrid, to a plug-in hybrid, to an all-electric, you can see here that the savings on maintenance are anywhere between 76 to 89% if you drive an EV versus a gas-powered vehicle. So the total cost of ownership here from that same New York study of over 1,800 vehicles, if we factor in the more expensive purchase price of the electric car, but the fact that the fuel and the maintenance is way cheaper, then over a period of 9 years, your total cost of ownership is 21% lower with the electric vehicle with no government rebate. And if you were to get a generous $5,000 rebate from the federal government, let's say, it would be about a 30% savings in terms of comparing to a gas car. And then, of course, all of the benefits that we already shared with you before in terms of reducing greenhouse gases, reducing downstream health effects, and even saving lives. So EVs are definitely the way to go. Just one last comment, though, before we close, that changing to an EV is important, but it's not enough by itself to meet our climate targets. If all of the Canadians in the country now switch to an EV tomorrow, they would get, let's say, 60% reduction in their carbon emissions, and that's about 24% of their total carbon footprint. That's only about 14% of all the greenhouse gases emitted in Canada. So we would urge you to look further. You can look on our website and many other places to look at other ways to reduce your carbon footprint in terms of your travel habits, your diet, how you heat your home, what you buy, and so forth. And that is sort of briefly summarized here in this chart, where you can see the other big parts of the carbon footprint, including cows. So lastly, I just wanted to mention about government policy and its impact on climate, because I think this is very important. We all need to be vocal on the issues and vote accordingly. This is what has happened globally in 2017 in terms of where governments across the world put our tax dollars. Only about $143 billion went into subsidizing renewable energy, and in fossil fuels, 5.3 trillion tax dollars, or about 37 times the amount that's going into renewables, was used to subsidize fossil fuels. And on top of that, the 33 world's biggest banks put another 1.9 trillion of investment into those same fossil fuel interests. There is no way renewables are ever going to win if we keep stacking the deck against them, and we need to tell our governments this is not okay. If we look at policy, so between 1990 and 2016, the UK has actually been able to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by about 41%, but in Canada, we've gone up by 17%. We're nowhere near meeting our climate targets. Even if we only just care about money, there is a high cost to delaying action on climate change. For every $1 spent on the reducing the risk of future hazards, now would save $6 in future disaster costs. And here's some examples of some very expensive climate change driven natural disasters that happened in Canada over the last couple of decades. You can see here that Fort McMurray fire, over $5 billion in damage just from that event alone. So by 2050, climate change is projected to cost Canadians between $21 and $43 billion per year. So if you care about money, this is important. If you care about health, this is important. If you care about your kids and your grandkids, this is super important. Now, we might feel that this is an unattainable goal. We can't change the world. We have to remember that actually it takes very little. So social science have actually studied this. And when we look at mass changes in public opinion, you actually don't need to change everyone's mind. You only need to convince about 3.5% of the population before popular opinion will begin to change. And so that's not a large amount if we really start thinking about what each of us can do towards that goal. The reason we got into this work around climate change is because we have a daughter who we love, and we wanted to see her grow up in a world that she can enjoy the same lifestyle as we did. And we're sure that each of you have a reason in your heart why you care the most about climate change. When you leave this presentation, you probably won't remember all the facts, but you will always remember what matters most in your heart. So if you go to that place and think about the things that matter most to you, that's what can drive you to want to do more. we are the first generation to feel the effects of climate change. And unfortunately, we're also the last generation that can make the changes necessary before it's too late. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and we would be happy to answer questions. Please visit our website at truthonclimate.com to download our guide on how you can reduce your carbon footprint. And you can also reach us at truthonclimate@gmail.com. We'd be happy to speak at your events as well. We don't charge for this service. We're doing this from the heart. Thanks for your attention, and we'll take questions.
Well, Dr. Lee and Dr. Theal, thank you very much indeed. That was excellent. I hope you're hearing a virtual round of applause, as is appropriate these days online. That was absolutely terrific to see such well-referenced data and information. It's always sobering to see information on climate change, but I found it particularly helpful to see the climate crisis in the context of the pandemic and the specific impacts on Canada. One thing in particular that I thought was quite uplifting is that for every EV, there's $10,000 approximately of social benefits that come from driving it. So I know there are many EV owners and drivers listening now, so that's something that we didn't perhaps factor on when we considered the equation of investing in them. I've seen some great questions coming, and at this point I'd like to introduce you to EV Society member Kenneth Bacour, who's offered to take us through some of the questions that the attendees have submitted. And so over to you, Ken.
Thanks, Nino, and thank you, doctors, for a great presentation. Let me get to our first question from Eric. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'm not hearing anything that nobody can, so that's great. Eric asks, how could we treat this environmental crisis as a second major pandemic that it truly is?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, well, I think, you know, we all recognize that it is actually as big as COVID-19, if not bigger, because of all the public health implications. I think it's through education and awareness. And so that's why we've been doing this for the past couple of years. We want to change as many minds as possible. We think that there's a ripple effect when you spread the information, you know, especially in a way that is digestible, that people can understand. It's not just a bunch of numbers, but it's something that, you know, strikes home, like something, you know, to do with their own health, their children's health, and so on and so forth, that it really does, you know, touch their heartstrings. And I think the more people do, the more people, the merrier doing this. I think that's the most important thing.
And I would just add to what Joyce said that I think, you know, climate change is something that is so insidious that a lot of people don't realize how fast it's catching up on us. And so people don't prioritize it as an issue. You know, they have kids to feed, they've got a pandemic to manage, and it just gets pushed off the plate. But when we look at how something that the scientists are predicting can on us and hit us in the face, like what happened with COVID-19. I think it's really good to connect COVID-19 to climate change when you're talking with people, because they can see that, oh, if we don't pay attention to the science on pandemics, look what happens. If we don't pay attention to the science with climate change, the same thing is going to happen, and in fact worse. So there's lots of bad things that happen because of the pandemic, but perhaps one good thing is people understanding the importance of science and being proactive about issues that are coming, that the scientists are telling us about.
Yeah, so I think that those of us who are sort of in the know, who are aware of how bad this crisis really is, needs to make our voices heard amongst our you know, connections, our acquaintances, our friends, family, and also in the political arena. Like, we can't just keep quiet anymore. Mm-hmm.
Especially when we've really only got 10 years to turn the corner on this. And actually some interesting data around COVID-19, looking at the average global decrease in carbon emissions as a result of lockdown. And what it showed is that in 2020, it's estimated about a 5.5% global reduction in carbon emissions because of lockdown activities. That probably sounds lower than you expected, but that's because over the whole year of 2020, there's expected to be an increase again as things started to open up after the spring. The reason why I'm mentioning that statistic is that in order for us to achieve those goals that are listed to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius of maximum global temperature change, we actually need to have that same global decrease in carbon emissions every single year for the next 10 years. So that's kind of scary when you think of all the changes we've had to make, even to just meet COVID-19, but it gives you some idea of the magnitude. What's reassuring, I think, is that the changes that were made to address the pandemic were not specifically to reduce carbon emissions. That was a byproduct. So if we put similar energy into directly carbon emissions, we can probably be much more effective with less impacts on our lifestyle.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's great that we can use what's going on now to help promote the awareness, as you mentioned earlier, and linking seriousness of COVID as an example to higher emission areas. That's one thing that we talk about a lot at EBS. So thank you for that. Next question is from John, who asks about when you calculate the carbon footprint of an EV versus an ICE vehicle, are you including in that calculation of the footprint the refining of the gas and the processes that occur before we burn it in that vehicle?
Yes, absolutely. So I know there was a lot of data in those slides, and I wish I could have had more time to spend on explaining them, but we wanted to get a lot of material covered in the time we had together. The slides that refer to the question, in the title of those slides, it says that we're using the GREET model. So the GREET model actually does take into account the manufacturer and the refining of whatever the source fuel is. So that's not just including gasoline, but also if an electric vehicle is charged with a nuclear power plant, what is the carbon impact of extracting and processing the fuel for the nuclear reactor? So yes, that is factored in.
Yeah, absolutely. And you made a great point of referencing one of the slides about where they're attaining data from. So like the West Virginia example or the Kansas example, it is something that viewers, listeners here, watchers need to, when you're looking at reports, look at those sources of data so you can make a better informed viewpoint of the data that you're seeing. So thank you for that answer. Aziz is asking about that it really seems that climate change denial in the West is really more aligned with the traditional political right. Why is that?
Oh my goodness.
In a short answer, I guess. I know we can go on and on, yes.
That's a charged question for sure. And I don't mean from an electric vehicle point of view when I say charged, but I mean, I guess, well, first of all, I think, we're all Canadians, and I really wouldn't want to comment on West versus East. I actually used to live in Alberta. It's a great part of the country. But he talks about denial in the West. Right?
Western world.
Yeah, so hard to say if you meant Western Canada.
You mean Western Canada or Western world?
Anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah. But I mean, and I'm only just gonna I have to give it, I'm not a political scientist, but it seems to me that the pattern is that often people who lean toward the political right or movements that are in the political right tend to prioritize economy over science. And so the scientific data tends to be sort of bulldozed by whatever the economic driver is of the day. And as long as the economy is doing well, that's all that seems to be the focus. That's just my, bystander opinion. So,
but I think if that's the impression, right, and if that's the reason, then it actually presents an opportunity, because right now renewable energy, there's a lot of talk about just recovery, green recovery, and so forth from COVID-19. And I think this is a very good opportunity for us to take stock and pressure our politicians to no longer put money into fossil fuels, to really invest in our future to be just and healthy for everybody. So I think, right now we're getting to a turning point where renewable energy is becoming more economically viable, right? Mm-hmm. There's actually more green sector jobs now in Canada, right, compared to fossil fuel jobs. And a lot of people in fossil fuels, I think they're sort of, or at least the workers anyways, they're a group of gas workers in Alberta that have formed a society to educate people about actually, the importance of climate change and switching to renewable energy. So I think people are sort of waking up. So I think we need to capitalize on that and just to make those voices louder and louder.
There's a very viable economy if we are purposeful and strategic in Canada to shift our focus to renewables. And somehow we just need to help people understand that change, because we should be skating where the puck is going. And you know, fossil fuels are they're washed up. I mean, we can keep investing in them, but we're not going to get our money back because inevitably we're going to have to shift to renewables. There really will be no choice. So if Canadians can all focus on that, and we can convince even politicians that are primarily focused about economy and jobs, which are important things, that actually we can get where we need to go with renewables, and moving away from fossil fuels earlier rather than later will actually leave us all better off.
Yeah, absolutely correct. Certainly awareness, education, and, you know, as you mentioned, it's encouraging when even the West is starting to look at different forms of energy versus not just fossil fuels. We're going to go to Dimitri, who's got a question. We've only got about a few minutes left, so probably one or two more questions, and then I'll turn it back to Nino. He's asking about COVID-19 pandemic's long-term effects. Can they actually have a positive and long-lasting effect on climate change? Because the whole lockdown, the work from home, you know, less commuting and all that kind of stuff. Do you foresee a longer positive impact there?
Certainly hoping, yeah, hoping for it. I think a lot of people realize during COVID-19, during the lockdown, like, you know, a lot of us stopped commuting to work, you know, and a lot of us, I think, realized that what was not possible, doing things virtually is now possible. And a lot of companies like Shopify, for example, have converted their entire operation to virtual. And I think more and more companies might actually do that, and people realize that they don't always have to drive, you know, like an hour to go to work. We don't always have to buy so much stuff to be happy. Mm-hmm. We don't always have to go to malls.
Even in the practice of medicine, actually, the COVID-19 pandemic has catalyzed a conversion to virtual care.
Overnight.
Where now, you know, actually at our hospital, we went from only about 2 to 5% of our patient visits being virtual to almost 60% in the period of just a couple of months. So that's, I mean, medicine doesn't change fast, but this is one example where it really did. Yeah. And I don't think as long as the government doesn't change the payment back to the way it was, where there was no way to pay a doctor for doing virtual care, hopefully they'll leave those billing codes available. That even after the pandemic is over, there are many times where it's more convenient and effective for the patient to have an appointment and a visit from home and just talk to the doctor through a video channel or through the telephone. So I'm hoping that some of those changes will stick long term, and it does reduce carbon impact too, because people aren't traveling as far to get appointments.
Yeah.
Definitely agree. And I'm in IT sales, and a lot of my customers, 25% workforce going back over the next 6 months or so. So it's going to be the new norm is certainly different. And hey, Amazon's doing drone deliveries soon, right? So it's all going to happen. Our last question then I'll put it back to Nino is, Tim's asking, how optimistic are you about the both of you, about the future really and our ability to deal with this climate change issue? You know, it's a great talk, but you know, is the optimism there?
Our daughter is in the room, so
yeah. Yes, I understand.
Yeah, well, we are. I think we're fairly optimistic because there's really no alternative. I think the reality, the truth, the absolute honest truth is that I think a lot more people would die from the climate crisis than COVID-19, and unfortunately, a lot of those people would be the less advantaged people in developing countries. And I think, you know, like the less advantaged people in developed countries will also be the ones who are hit with more illness and death. But I do think that humanity will survive overall, but perhaps not all of us.
I guess, so thank you for that heavy answer, Joyce. And I don't disagree with you, but I guess, so actually one of the whole reasons why we went and got trained with Al Gore was because I was just getting so depressed about climate change. I thought I was going to need happy pills. I just wanted to do something. And I think one of the things that I've had to sort of come to terms with in my own head is that climate change is not a black and white thing. It's not like we're trying to stop climate change from happening. It's already happened and it's going to keep happening. But what I see is that every action that each person takes to move things in the right direction is mitigating that effect, and that every action that we take is going to push out the year that things will get too bad, and it increase the chance that we will stay under 1.5 or under 2 degrees. So I prefer to see it that way, as shades of gray, as opposed to, oh, if I don't do these 100 things, then we're doomed, because I don't think it's black and white like that.
Totally agree. And, you know, I use my motto on my show, educating minds one tailpipe at a time, because that's where it starts. We have to be optimistic, and you guys certainly show that. I think everybody watching today is. So back to you, Nino. Thank you for that.
Thanks very much, Ken. And thank you once again, Drs. Lee and Theal. We very much appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with our EV community, and for giving us all some compelling actions to think about. To people watching live on the webinar who've asked about the slides, if you'd like to revisit these excellent slides, this whole video will be posted on the EV Society YouTube channel. I'd also like to thank the EV Society members who've been working behind the scenes to make this webinar work so smoothly. Finally, to everybody listening, we hope you will return for our next Canada Talks Electric Cars webinar on the first Tuesday in October. Please join EV Society, and we'll send you a reminder by email, so that will be a way of making sure that you don't miss it. Stay safe, everyone, and thank you for spending this time with us. This concludes today's webinar.